unfold and play out this election. And if we can, rather either at least start with or hit at some point what happened prior to November 2nd and then kind of where we are now. Would be great, Bill.
Okay, my big loud voice usually carries without this microphone. I don't know, I'm sure this thing's on, but it is on. Is there any difference when I'm talking like now?
No, there is if you hold it near your mouth.
Okay, all right. I was hoping that would be loud. So, I'm going to put it in a sort of an ongoing context and blend housing issues during the campaign with what actually took place during the campaign. And the intricacies of why the election came about as it did, or even people's view of what should have occurred during the election, depending on a given ideology, might be complicated, might interest a lot of people, and there's certainly fodder for conversation, et cetera. But at least for me, that's not what interests me the most. What interests me the most is what actually did happen during the election, what people did say, what people did do. And from where I sit, that's not all that complicated a proposition. What it foreshadows for the future in general and for housing in specific, that is something that has a great deal of nuance to it. But as you look at the election itself, you're going to hear some people you may have read, some people wanting to talk about turnout, who voted, who didn't vote. And there's some legitimacy in it, but the reality is this: to talk about who voted in absolute terms, meaning the total number of people who voted in 2010, and compare it to 2008, is somewhat an artificial comparison. The apt comparison is to compare 2006, which is another midterm election. They know from apples to apples. But just a matter of fact, in 2008, 13% of the electorate was African American. In 2010, 13% of the people who voted were African American. In 2008, in the presidential election, 9% of the people who voted were Hispanic, and in 2010, 9% of the people who voted were Hispanic. There was depression among younger voters, but I think you have to take a giant step back and say, sort of like the winter last year in Washington, D.C., should we expect the record to be set every time? And if you compare it to 2006, it's right at the 20-ish % mark, which is a little bit less than 2006, but not hugely so. That said, maybe there were races where a little difference here, a little difference there would have made had a margin of difference impact. But that doesn't look to me to be what occurred. In 2006, 91% of self-identified Republicans voted for Republicans. In 2010, it was 95%. In 2006, 93% of self-identified Democrats voted for Democrats, and in 2010, it was 92%. Golly, wonder what changed. In independents, in 2006, they voted for Democrats 57 to 39%. 57 to 39. That's a margin of plus 18. In 2010, they voted for Republicans by a margin of 55 to 39%. That's plus 16. That's 34 movement points. Stevie Wonder could read this down. Okay? You don't have to be a rocket scientist this year. What happened was independents in general, white independents in specific, overwhelmingly flipped. And what they said with their votes, and what they said in all the focus groups, all the quantitative research, is that in 2006 and in 2008, they were fed up with Republicans, especially George Bush. And after the financial meltdown in September of 2008, they said, we're going to give the Democrats a chance to run everything. And you can argue that all of these things that I'm about to describe were needed. You can argue they were all good. You can argue everybody's perception about it was wrong. Again, I'm just talking about what people actually said and did. When it came to the stimulus, the GM bailout, health care, which I want to come back to, and even housing, because housing and health care in some ways are placeholders, cap and trade, what independents said was, focusing on a lot of other people other than me. This isn't what I asked for. And in a country where 40% roughly describe themselves as conservative, and 30% self-describe themselves as moderate, and less than 20%, again, rightly, wrongly, I'm not interested in that at this point, describe themselves as liberal. What did anyone think was going to happen during these debates? And these independents felt themselves ignored and maybe even disrespected. They took a defiant tone. And if you look back and look at Harold Meyerson in the Washington Post, the week before the Democratic March on Washington, he described who was going to come to Washington as, quote, a coalition of black, Latino, feminist, gay, and lesbian civil rights groups, unions, and environmental organizations. He even lamented the absence of white working class, et cetera, et cetera. The point being that these white independents, again, rightly or wrongly, felt as though what was going on in Washington was hugely disconnected from them and their concerns, that when they made it known they were not very happy about a variety of things, they were told all manner of responses which they didn't like. So, take healthcare, take housing, okay? With housing, with this, we'll pay your mortgage, we'll do this, we'll do that, go back to that white independent, and at least in the elections I was involved in, the people that attended town hall meetings and those kinds of things, it was like, wait a minute. If somebody's suffering some bad luck, or they're out of a job for a little while, I can understand that. But don't tell me that somebody that bought a house they never could afford in the first place, or it's their second house, that somehow you need to take more money out of my pocket to make good for that person. Now maybe that's all myth, it's wrong, but that's what they thought and believed. And so what happened in 2010 is overwhelmingly these independents went to the polls and voted against the Democrats. 70% of the people say more accurately describes that they voted against the Democrats than that they voted for the Republicans. Now, when they voted against the Democrats, fortunately for we Republicans, by process of elimination, most of the time we were the only ones left standing for whom the vote could be favorably cast. But make no mistake about it, nobody voted in 2010 for the Republicans to enact some sort of specific, detailed agenda. That's not what happened. What happened was people said they were fed up with what they were seeing, or this group of people, I should say, Republicans plus these independents. We're fed up, and here's what it means. Now, hopefully down the line we can talk about this in more enduring terms, this balkanization of the electorate and what it foreshadows in a variety of things, because I, for one, at least think we're headed to very dangerous territory when one party is populated almost exclusively by white Americans and the other party has an overwhelming percentage of non-white voters. That's not going to be good for America over the long term. But what I will say is that as you go forward in 2011, what's going to happen? We're going to talk about some of the specifics with Jeff Epstein, Scott Garrett, and Royce, and all these other people. These are folks that they do have very detailed thoughts in their mind about the role of government and what it should do, can do, and can't do. And it's going to be, there's a new sheriff in town in the House of Representatives. And how that evolves out and what the White House does about it, that's hopefully some of the stuff that we're going to be able to get to and discuss. But the bottom line is as simple as this. Independents, in general,